Ready for a deep dive? And no, we're not talking about scuba gear this time.
We're diving into the world of international finance. But don't worry, this isn't some boring lecture about interest rates.
Not at all.
This is about something way more interesting. It's about how China is changing the game when companies go broke. And I mean globally broke.
Right, like companies with businesses all over the world.
Exactly.
We've got this legal review from the Asia Pacific Restructuring Review. It's the 2025 edition.
Okay.
And it's called, get this, Firsts for China in Cross-Border Insolvency Proceedings. Catchy, right?
But don't let the title fool you. This thing is a real page-turner. Seriously.
Yeah.
It talks about how China is taking some, well, pretty unprecedented steps when it comes to companies that have assets all over the globe.
So we're talking about this whole world of cross-border insolvency and why these firsts that the article highlights are actually a pretty big deal.
Yeah, break that down for us.
So imagine this. It's like a giant game of financial Jenga, right?
Okay.
But instead of just one tower, you've got pieces scattered across a bunch of different countries.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
And when a company goes bust, the question becomes, well, whose rules apply? Whose courts get to decide how to divide up all those assets?
It gets complicated fast.
Exactly. It's a mess.
So what were some of those surprising firsts that you noticed in this review?
Because one that really jumped out at me was China, actually, for the first time ever, recognizing a Japanese insolvency proceeding.
That is huge. I mean, for years, getting China to actually recognize a foreign court's decision about a company's assets within its borders, forget it. It was practically impossible.
Yeah.
Like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
It just wasn't happening.
This case with Japan, that's a massive shift. Could be a sign that they're finally willing to play ball on the international stage.
Yeah, it's like they're finally joining the club.
In a way.
And it's not just Japan. This review also talks about the first ever pilot program for cross-border insolvency cooperation between mainland China and, drumroll please, Hong Kong.
Right. And that's a whole other story.
Totally different ballgame.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the weeds on that relationship,
I think it's important to really understand why these firsts are such a big deal in the first place. Because for a long time, cooperation on insolvency matters between China and a lot of other countries, let's just say it was pretty much non-existent.
yeah, it was tough. You had a lack of treaties, totally different legal systems, not to mention sometimes, political tensions.
Yeah.
It all added up to a massive headache for anyone trying to untangle a company's finances across borders.
Yeah, I bet.
So these cases, these firsts, do they suggest that China's stance is changing? Like they're finally ready to play by the international rules, at least when it comes to these financial matters?
It's definitely a possibility. And the article points out some really specific cases that support that idea. Like there's one involving a German company.
Yeah.
And a Chinese court actually went ahead and presumed reciprocity, meaning they basically said, okay, we'll recognize these German insolvency proceedings as valid, even though there was no formal agreement in place between the two countries.
Wow, that's a bold move.
It is.
It's like they're saying, look, we're willing to be flexible, figure out ways to work together, even if all the legal stuff isn't perfectly lined up.
Exactly.
And then there's the case with the Xiamen Maritime Court. They recognized a Singaporean judicial manager, which is basically someone appointed by a Singaporean court to oversee a company's assets during insolvency proceedings.
Okay, can we break that down for a second?
What?
What exactly is a judicial manager in plain English?
Sure. Think of them as like a financial referee appointed by the court to make sure everything's on the up and up during this whole insolvency process.
Yeah.
They've got the power to step in, take control of the company's assets, and they try to find the best outcome for everyone involved. Creditors, shareholders, you name it.
So in this case, a Chinese court basically said, all right, Singapore, we trust your guy to handle this, even though it was a Singaporean court that put him in charge.
Precise.
That's a pretty big deal, isn't it?
It is, for a couple of reasons. First, it shows that China's becoming more willing to recognize and work within those internationally accepted insolvency practices.
Right, like they're saying, we see how the rest of the world does it, and we're ready to get on board.
Exactly. And second, the fact that it was a maritime court that did this. It highlights just how crucial international trade, especially maritime trade, is becoming to China's economy.
They're realizing that in our super interconnected world, being able to navigate cross-border insolvency smoothly is essential for keeping those economic ties strong.
Like they're finally acknowledging that the business world doesn't stop at their borders.
Exactly.
And speaking of navigating tricky legal waters, let's talk about Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah.
We've got that whole one country, two systems
Yeah.
situation, right? Separate legal systems, separate economies. Sounds simple enough, at least on paper.
Right.
But what happens when a company with assets in both places goes belly up? That's when things get really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the real headache starts. It was a recipe for disaster, really. You can imagine a company with its headquarters in Hong Kong, manufacturing in mainland China. Bam! Suddenly it's all going south.
Total chaos.
Trying to sort out whose laws apply, which courts have the authority. It was a nightmare.
And it sounds like this pilot program, though, this is a sign that they're actually serious about fixing that, about bridging that gap between the mainland and Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's a big step. The article even gets into some of the specifics, like these new guidelines that are supposed to make it easier for the mainland and Hong Kong courts to work together.
Oh, interesting.
One of the biggest changes is that now mainland China is saying they'll recognize a wider range of those insolvency proceedings that get started in Hong Kong.
So before, it was like, what, they were only recognizing a handful of cases.
Yeah, the scope was super limited. It made things incredibly difficult for creditors, for the courts. Anyone who was trying to actually recover assets or restructure debt, it was a mess.
But now it's like problem solved.
It's definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, think about it. Anyone doing business in both places, they don't have to worry so much about getting stuck in legal limbo just because of where a company decided to set up shop.
Right. That makes sense. No more getting caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And this whole idea of greater cooperation, it's not just about corporate insolvency either. This review even touches on what's happening in Shenzhen with these personal bankruptcy regulations.
Oh, yeah, I was curious about that. It seems like a pretty big deal, even though, like you said, it's not about corporations.
It's huge. Right now, China as a whole doesn't even have a nationwide law for personal bankruptcy.
Really?
Nope.
Wow.
Which means if you're an individual in China and you're drowning in debt, you don't really have the same options that a big corporation would to try and get back on your feet.
So there's no way for them to, like, renegotiate with their creditors or anything. They're just stuck.
It's a lot trickier, that's for sure. There's been a lot of debate about this. A lot of people calling for a national law.
I bet. Because on the one hand, I can see how it would be really important for protecting everyday people from a complete financial ruin, right?
Absolutely.
And it could even encourage entrepreneurship, right? If people are too scared to take risks because there's no safety net.
That's the argument, yeah. They look at other countries where these personal bankruptcy laws are in place, and they're saying, look, this works.
But I'm sure there's another side to this, too. People who are worried that a law like that could be abused or that it would change how people think about debt in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. There's concern that it could lead to people taking advantage of the system or that it would discourage lenders from giving out loans. It's like, why loan money if it becomes too easy for people to just walk away from their debts, right?
Yeah, I could see that.
And then there's the whole cultural aspect, too, this idea of personal responsibility when it comes to finances. It's deeply rooted in China.
It's a tough one, for sure. But the fact that Shenzhen, and we all know Shenzhen, it's a powerhouse, right? The fact that they've been trying out these regulations since 2021, that says something.
It does. They're like the testing grounds.
It's like China's dipping their toes in the water, seeing what happens before they even think about making a big splash with a national law.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder what other changes might be on the horizon, right?
For sure.
Like this whole deep dive we've been doing into how China's approach to insolvency is evolving, it paints a pretty interesting picture. It's like they're becoming more and more integrated into the global economy. And that comes with its own set of growing pains.
That's true.
Like they're realizing they have to adapt. They have to engage with these international legal frameworks, even if it means changing how they've traditionally done things.
It's a huge adjustment for sure, but a necessary one, I think.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder what this means for other areas of law, right?
Oh, for sure. It's like watching a really slow game of chess.
Right.
And for anyone who's doing business in China or even just with China, understanding these shifts, that's key. It's not just about, the legal nitty-gritty.
Right. It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about trying to figure out what China's next move is going to be in the grand scheme of things.
Totally. I mean, take something like intellectual property rights, for example.
Huge issue.
China's always had, let's just say, a different approach.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
But as they become even more integrated with global markets, is that going to change? Could we see them start to move towards more protection, more alignment with international standards?
It's definitely within the realm of possibility. And then there's the whole world of international trade agreements.
Right.
I mean, China's influence Economically speaking, it's only growing.
It's undeniable.
And that means they have more power to shape those global trade deals, set the terms.
So how they act in one area, like insolvency law, that might be a clue to how they're going to approach things in other areas.
It's a distinct possibility.
It's like this deep dive into this one very specific area of law has given us this, like, unexpected glimpse into China's overall game plan, you know?
Exactly. And look, we can't predict the future, but
If only.
by paying attention to these, seemingly small legal details, we can start to connect the dots.
And maybe even anticipate what's coming next.
Precisely. Because when it comes to international finance, global commerce, the people who can see those changes coming, they're the ones who are going to succeed.
That's the name of the game.
It really is.
Well, this has been fascinating, a real eye-opener.
It has. I always enjoy getting into the weeds on this stuff.
Me too. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We hope you learned something new today, something to think about. And until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.